They told me a wolf would never save a human, that if the cold didn't take me, the pack would, that a girl from Hearthstone walking into the Karth Mountains alone in winter was just a slow way of dying. They were wrong about the wolf. He pulled me out of a river that had already decided to keep me. He carried me 3 miles through snow that came up to his ribs. He gave me his fire, his furs, his own hands pressed flat against my heart until it remembered how to beat. And I thought, God help me, I actually thought that the hardest part was already behind me. Then the Wolf King looked at me across that fire with those tired gray eyes, and he asked me for something. One thing. The thing he had crossed half a frozen valley to find. And it was the most unthinkable thing anyone has ever asked of me. Stay with me, because what he wanted next is going to break your heart before it mends it, and I promise you, you have never heard a love story that begins this way. The river had a sound I will hear for the rest of my life. Not a roar. People think drowning is loud, all thrashing and screaming, but it isn't. It's a hush. The water closed over my head and the whole world went soft and far away, like someone had wrapped wool around my ears, and I remember thinking how strange it was that dying felt so much like falling asleep in a warm room. My name is Myra Calloway. I was 24 years old, and I was certain those would be my last seconds. I had broken through the ice crossing the gray water, which was the kind of stupid mistake I had spent my whole life being too careful to make. I knew better. My mother had drilled it into me before the fever took her. Never trust river ice after the first thaw. Never cross where the current runs fast underneath. Never travel the Karth alone. I had broken all 3 rules in a single afternoon, and the river was collecting on the debt. The cold went through me like a blade, and then, mercifully, it stopped feeling like anything at all. My pack of medicines, the only thing I owned that mattered, slipped off my shoulder and sank. I watched it go down into the green dark. 41 little glass vials, 3 years of work. My whole life drifting away beneath me, and I didn't even have the strength left to reach for it. That was when something seized the back of my coat. I don't have a word for the strength of it. It wasn't a hand. It was bigger than a hand, and it hauled me up through the broken ice with a force that scraped my ribs raw against the jagged edge, and suddenly I was on the snow, on my back, vomiting river water and staring up at a gray sky. And standing over me was a wolf the size of a horse. I should have been afraid. Any sane person from my village would have been afraid. We grew up on stories of the Karth packs, the wolves that walked like men, that ruled the high valleys, that we were told to fear the way you fear a storm or a winter. My grandfather used to say that if you ever saw the Wolf King, you were already as good as eaten. But I was too cold to be afraid. I lay there shivering so hard my teeth cracked together, and the great gray wolf lowered its head and breathed warm air across my frozen face. And its eyes, I will never forget this, its eyes were not the eyes of an animal. They were ancient and sad and entirely human, and they were looking at me the way you'd look at someone you'd been searching for a very long time. Then the world went black. I woke to firelight and the smell of pine resin and the soft, irregular sound of someone breathing nearby, trying to be quiet about it. For a long moment I didn't move. I had learned that, growing up, that when you wake somewhere unfamiliar, you keep your breathing even and your eyes nearly shut, and you find out everything you can before anyone knows you're awake. A girl alone learns these things. So I lay still and I learned. I was in a bed, a real bed, not a cot, with furs heaped over me so thick I could barely feel my own legs. There was a fire in a stone hearth across the room, and the room itself was large, with timber walls and a high ceiling lost in shadow. Through a narrow window I could see snow falling, soft and endless, lit silver by a moon I couldn't see. And there was a man sitting beside the fire, watching it, not me. His back was to me. He was big, broad through the shoulders in a way that filled the chair, with dark hair gone gray at the temples and a stillness about him that wasn't peaceful. It was the stillness of someone holding something heavy and refusing to set it down. I shifted just slightly, and the furs whispered. He went rigid. Then slowly he turned, and I saw his face for the first time, and I knew those eyes. Gray, ancient, sad. "You're awake," he said. His voice was low and rough, like he didn't use it often. "Good. I wasn't sure you would be." I tried to sit up. My whole body screamed in protest, every muscle bruised and trembling, and I gasped and fell back against the pillows. "Don't," he said, half rising. "Your body's been through more than it can carry. You were in the water a long time, longer than anyone should survive." He sat back down, and his hands curled around the arms of the chair like he was bracing himself. "I'm Sauron," he said, "and before you ask, yes, I'm the one they warned you about. The Wolf King." I should have screamed. I should have run, even though I couldn't have made it 3 steps. Instead, I heard my own voice come out small and cracked and honest. "My medicines," I said. "I had a pack of medicines. They went into the river." Of all the things to say, not "thank you for saving my life," not "please don't kill me." I asked about my 41 vials because they were the only part of me that mattered, and somewhere deep down I would rather have lost myself than lost them. Something crossed his face, surprise, I think, and then something gentler that I didn't have a name for yet. "Gone," he said quietly. "I'm sorry I couldn't reach them. I could only reach you." And I did the thing I am least proud of. I turned my face into the pillow, this near stranger's bed, in the home of the creature my whole village feared above all others, and I cried. Not delicate tears. Ugly, shaking, exhausted sobs, the kind I hadn't let myself cry in the 8 months since my sister died, all of it coming loose at once because I had nothing left to hold it back with. Sauron didn't touch me. He didn't tell me it would be all right, the way people do when they have no idea whether it will be. He just stayed, sitting very still in his chair, keeping watch over a weeping human girl as the fire burned low, and somehow that was the kindest thing he could have done. His home was called Greywatch, and it was nothing like the den of monsters I'd been raised to imagine. It was a stronghold built into the mountainside, all timber and gray stone, with long halls and high windows and the constant low murmur of a community living close together against the cold. Over the next 3 days, as my strength came back in slow and grudging pieces, I learned that the Karth packs were not the snarling beasts of Hearthstone bedtime stories. They were people. They lived as people. They cooked and argued and laughed and raised children and buried their dead. And the only difference between them and the village I'd come from was that under the full moon, or in a moment of need, they could become something older and faster and far more dangerous than any human. But there was something wrong at Greywatch. I felt it before I understood it. It was too quiet. The halls were too empty for a place that size. And the people I did see moved with a kind of careful heaviness, the way mourners move, and more than once I saw a door left ajar onto a room with a bed in it, and someone lying in that bed too still, too pale, with that gray cast to the skin that I had seen before, that I had spent 3 years learning to fight. On the 3rd day I found Sauron in the great hall, alone, staring into the fire again. He did a great deal of staring into fires. "Your people are sick," I said. I had never been good at easing into things. He didn't look at me. "Yes." "How many?" A long silence. "When the cold came, 11, now 30-some. By the time the thaw comes," he stopped. His jaw worked. "We call it the gray rot. It starts in the lungs, a cough, a tiredness. Then the strength goes. Then the body forgets how to keep itself warm and the skin turns." And he turned to me at last and his eyes were wet, and a king who could become a wolf the size of a horse looked at me like a man with nothing left. "My brother has it," he said. "Edric. He's all the family I have left. He's been in that bed for 11 days. The healers we have can do nothing. I have watched my people die one by one, and I cannot do a single thing to stop it, and a king who cannot protect his own is no king at all." I sat down across from him. My heart was doing something painful in my chest. "Describe it to me," I said, "all of it from the beginning." And he did. And as he spoke, the cough, the wasting, the cold that no fire could touch, the gray that crept up from the chest to the throat, something in me went very still and very certain, the way it always did when I recognized an enemy I'd fought before. "It's not a rot," I said quietly. "It's marsh lung. We had it in Hearthstone 4 winters ago. It killed 19 people before I swallowed. Before I learned how to stop it." Soren went absolutely motionless. "You can cure it. Can treat it, there's a difference. The ones who are far gone, I can't promise anything. But the early ones, the cough, the tiredness, yes, I've done it before. I felt the cold weight of the river in my chest, the loss settling in fresh. But I can't. Soren, I'm sorry. The medicine I make for it, fireweed root, marrow thistle, a fungus that only grows on the north faces, 3 other things, every bit of it was in that pack, in the river. It took me 3 years to gather and prepare. I have nothing. I am nothing now but a girl who knows how, with no means to do it." I expected him to crumble. Instead, something kindled in those gray eyes, a desperate, dangerous hope. "Then tell me what you need," he said, leaning forward. "Name every herb, every root, every fungus on every north face of every mountain in this range, and I will put 100 of my fastest on the trails before nightfall. We know these mountains better than any human ever could. If it grows in the Karth, we will find it." He reached across the table, and his hand stopped just short of mine, hovering, asking permission it didn't quite take. "Please. I have been a king my whole life, and I have never begged anyone for anything. I am begging you now." And there it was, the thing I'd thought he wanted, to save his people, to save his brother. A noble, desperate, understandable thing. I almost said yes right then. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because that wasn't the unthinkable thing. That was just the beginning of it. We worked together for 9 days. He was true to his word. By the morning after our conversation, runners were on every trail in the Karth, and they came back with their packs full of frozen roots and bark, and the strange pale fungus that I'd never expected to see again. They brought me the wrong things, too. They couldn't read the difference between marrow thistle and the poison that mimicked it, and I had to sit with the gatherers and teach them, pressing the leaves into their hands, making them smell the bitter undersides, until they could tell my life-givers from my killers by touch alone. I set up in a corner of the great hall with a fire and a kettle, and every bowl and grinding stone they could find me. And I worked. I worked until my hands cracked and bled, until my eyes burned, until I fell asleep mid-sentence and woke with my cheek pressed to a table covered in herb dust. Because every hour I spent was an hour someone in those still rooms had or didn't have. Soren never left. That was the thing I noticed first, then couldn't stop noticing. A king has 1,000 demands on his time, and he ignored every one of them to sit with me through those long nights, fetching what I needed, holding the bowls steady when my hands shook, learning the names of plants he'd walked past his whole life without knowing they could save him. We talked in the small hours, the way people do when they're too tired to keep their walls up. I learned that he'd been king since he was 19, when his father died in a rockfall that he still believed was his fault for choosing that pass. I learned that he'd had a wife, once years ago, and that she died in childbirth along with the child, and that he had never let himself want anyone since, because wanting things, in his experience, was just a way of giving the world something to take from you. I learned that he loved his brother Edric more than his own life, that they'd raised each other after their father died, and that the thought of burying him was the one thing this enormous, powerful creature could not face. And he learned about me, about Leela, my little sister, who I'd raised after our mother died, who I'd promised to keep safe, who had caught marsh lung in the 5th winter when I was off in the next valley trading for supplies, and who was already too far gone by the time I got home. I'd had the medicine. I'd had it in my hands. I just hadn't been there in time to give it to her. That was why I'd left Hearthstone, why I'd walked into the Karth alone in winter like someone who didn't much care whether she came out the other side. Because every face in that village reminded me of the one I hadn't saved. That's why, Soren said softly one night, watching me grind marrow thistle into paste long after I should have slept. That's why you won't stop, even now, even for strangers. I didn't look up. I couldn't save her, I said. So I save everyone else I can. It's a poor trade, but it's the only one I've got. He was quiet for a moment. You and I, he said, are more alike than I expected a wolf and a human to be. And I felt something turn over in my chest that I had no business feeling. Not here, not now, not for him. The first patients began to turn. The early ones, the ones with just the cough and the tiredness, started to mend within 4 days of the first dose. I'll never forget the morning. A woman named Tessa walked into the great hall on her own 2 feet, pale and thin but upright, and looked at me like I was something holy. And I had to leave the room because I couldn't let them see me cry over the one I'd done right when the wrong one was still so loud in me. But not everyone turned. Edric didn't turn. He was too far gone 11 days when I should have had him at 3. I gave him everything I had, double doses, treatments I'd never dared try on someone so weak, and his fever broke and came back and broke again, and Soren sat by his brother's bed through every hour I wasn't forcing him to help me, holding a hand that was getting colder, and I knew. I knew the way I'd known with Leela. I knew, and I couldn't make myself say it. On the 9th night, Edric woke clear-eyed for the first time in days, and he asked to see his brother alone, and whatever passed between them in that room, Soren came out of it looking 100 years old. Edric died before dawn. I found Soren on the high wall of Greywatch in the gray hour after, standing in the falling snow without a coat, looking out at the white mountains as if he could find an answer in them. I didn't know what to say. There is nothing to say. I had learned that the hard way, so I just came and stood beside him, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched, and I let the snow fall on both of us and I waited. I've buried everyone I've ever loved, he said finally. His voice was empty in a way that frightened me more than rage would have. My father, my wife, my son before he ever drew breath, and now Edric. I told myself if I just stopped wanting anything, stopped letting anyone close, the dying would stop too, that it was the wanting that was the wound. He turned to me, and there were tears frozen on his face. And then you fell into my river. I didn't understand then what he meant. You saved 32 of my people, Myra. 32 who'd have been dead by spring. The whole pack knows it. They're calling you a gift the mountain sent. And all I can think, he stopped. His hands were shaking, and not from the cold. All I can think is that you came 9 days too late to save the one person I couldn't bear to lose, and that's not your fault. None of it is your fault, but I am so tired of being a place where things come to die. Soren, I have to ask you for something, he said, and the words came out of him like they cost him everything. And I need you to know before I do that I have no right to ask it, that you've already given us more than we could ever repay, that you are free to walk out of here at first light and never look back, and I'll send you home with everything you could carry and a debt I'll owe you till I die. The snow fell. My heart was pounding. Ask, I said. He looked at me for a long moment. This king, this wolf, this grieving man, and what he said next was not what I expected. And it was not noble, and it was not simple, and it changed everything. Stay, he said. Not as our healer. We could ask you to be our healer and you might even say yes out of duty, and I don't want your duty. I have spent 31 years closing every door in myself so that nothing could get out and nothing could get in. And then you fell into my river and you cried over your lost medicines instead of begging for your life. And I have not had a single hour since where I wasn't thinking about you. His voice broke. I want you to stay because I am asking you, Soren, not the king, to choose a life that has me in it. And I know what that means. I'm a wolf. You're human. My kind doesn't love halfway. If I let myself love you, it's a bond that goes down to the bone, the kind that's killed humans who weren't strong enough to carry it. I'd be asking you to leave everything you are, to risk something I can't even promise you'll survive, to tie yourself to a man who's done nothing his whole life but lose people. That's what I'm asking. That's how selfish I am. After everything, that's the thing I want from you. And there it was. The unthinkable thing. Not my medicine, not my hands, not my knowledge of marsh-lung. He wanted me to stay and let myself be loved by something that might kill me. And worse, far worse, he wanted me to want it back. I stood on that wall in the snow, 8 months out from a sister I'd failed, 3 years of work at the bottom of a river, the whole careful life I'd built around the single rule of never let anyone that close again. And I looked at the one person who'd ever asked me to break it. I didn't answer him that night. I want you to understand how hard that was to stand there with the snow coming down and the most honest thing anyone had ever said to me still hanging in the air between us, and to say nothing. Because part of me already knew. Part of me had known since the third night, when his hands shook holding a bowl of medicine for strangers, and I'd thought, this is not a monster. This is a man drowning slower than I was. The knowing was there. It was the saying it out loud I couldn't manage. So I said the cowardly true thing instead. Give me until the thaw. And Soren, who could have been wounded by that, who had just laid himself open to the bone and got and let me think about it in return, Soren just nodded like it was more than he'd hoped for. Until the thaw, he said. Stay through the winter. Be our healer, be a stranger, be whatever you need to be. I won't ask again. When the pass is open, if you want to go, I'll walk you to the edge of the karth myself, and I'll never trouble you with any of this again. Then he turned and went inside, and left me alone on the wall with the mountains and the snow and the worst, most dangerous feeling I knew, hope. Winter at Greywatch was long, and I spent it learning how to live in the in-between. I worked. That part was easy. That part I knew how to do. I kept the marsh-lung from coming back, taught 2 of the pack's young healers everything I knew so they'd never again be helpless against it, built up stores of dried herb in the larders against the next bad winter. I delivered a baby in the cold dark of the longest night, a squalling, perfect girl, and the mother named her after me, and I held that child and felt something in my chest crack quietly open that had been sealed shut since Leela. And I lived alongside Soren, and we were careful, and the carefulness nearly killed us both. Because here's what nobody tells you about keeping your distance from someone. It doesn't make the feeling smaller. It just makes you feel it in the smallest things. The way he'd leave the chair nearest the fire empty when I came into the hall every time without ever saying so. The way I learned the sound of his step and would look up before he came through the door. The way our hands would brush passing a cup, and we'd both go still and then pretend nothing had happened. A whole winter of nothing happening, and I have never in my life felt so much. I learned the truth of what he'd warned me about too, the bond. I asked the old healer Bram about it, a grizzled man who'd served 3 kings and had no patience for softness. I asked him straight, what did it mean when a wolf bonded a human? He looked at me a long time. It means, he said slowly, the wolf gives up the part of himself that can love anyone else ever again for as long as he lives. They don't choose lightly, and it means the human, he stopped. There's a calling, a fever of the blood. The wolf's nature reaches into the human and asks the body to carry something it was never built to carry. The strong ones live. They change, they age slower, they feel the wolf's heart beating in their own chest across any distance, they belong to the pack in their very bones. His jaw tightened. The weak ones die in the calling, burn up in 3 days, I've seen it twice. Once she lived, once she didn't. He fixed me with a hard old stare. If he's asked you, girl, then he's already decided he'd rather lose you to the calling than live without trying. Don't you dare let him. A king who burns up a human for his own loneliness is no king worth having. I went away from that conversation cold all the way through. Not because I was afraid of dying. I'd walked into these mountains half wanting to, 8 months ago. I was afraid of something worse. I was afraid that I wanted it. The Heartstone men came on the first warm day of the thaw. There were 9 of them, armed, half frozen from the climb, and at the front of them was Garrick, the blacksmith's son, who'd wanted to marry me for 3 years and never once understood the word no. They'd come, they said, to rescue me. Word had reached the village that a girl from Hearthstone had been taken by the wolves of the Karth, and they had come to bring me home, by force if the beasts wouldn't give me up. It would have been almost funny if it hadn't been so close to bloodshed. I came out into the courtyard and found Sauron's whole pack ranged silent along the walls, and Sauron himself standing between them and the 9 men with his arms loose at his sides, not transformed, not threatening, just waiting, giving them the chance to turn around that wolves in the stories never gave anyone. And I understood, watching him hold his people back with nothing but his stillness, that he could have killed all 9 of them in the time it takes to draw a breath, and that he would die before he'd let it come to that in front of me. Myra, Garrick's face flooded with relief, then twisted into something uglier when I didn't run to him. What have they done to you? Come away from it, come here. No one took me, Garrick, I said, my voice carried in the cold air. I walked here. I broke through the river ice and the king pulled me out, and I have spent the whole winter saving lives, 32 of them, more than I ever saved in Hearthstone. I felt my hands trembling and made them stop. These aren't the monsters we were told about. I'm not a prisoner. I'm a healer, and these are my patients, and you are standing in my home with weapons drawn. The word home landed in the courtyard like a struck bell. I heard Sauron's breath catch. I hadn't planned to say it. It just came out because it was true. Garrick stared at me like I'd grown a second head. You choose them over your own kind, over, his voice cracked, over me. And here was the heavy thing. Here was the choice that cost. Because I knew in that moment that whatever I said next would close a door behind me forever. These were the people I'd grown up among. Garrick wasn't cruel, not really. He was just a frightened man raised on the same stories I had been, who'd loved me clumsily and wanted to save me from a danger that didn't exist. If I went with them, I'd have my old life back, my village, my language, my dead sister's grave that I'd left untended, the whole human world I belonged to. And if I stayed, I would be, to every person I'd ever known, a woman who'd chosen beasts over her own blood. They'd say I'd been bewitched. They'd never speak my name without spitting after it. I would be erased from the only place that had ever been mine. I looked at Garrick. Then I looked at Sauron, who was watching me with an expression that was trying so hard not to hope that it broke my heart cleaner than any words could have. I'm staying, I said. Go home, Garrick. Tell them I'm well. Tell them I'm where I want to be. And tell them, my voice wavered and I let it, tell them to tend my sister's grave since I won't be coming back to do it. Tell them Leela Calloway had a sister who finally learned how to keep a promise, even if it was 8 months too late. Garrick stared at me for a long, terrible moment. Then he spat on the stones of the courtyard, turned, and led his men back down the mountain. And I stood there and watched the last bridge to everything I'd ever been burned quietly to ash, and I did not cry, and that frightened me most of all. That night Sauron found me on the wall, our wall, the one where he'd asked. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. I'd have let you go with them. I told you I would. I know. They'll never forgive you, your people. I know that too. I watched the dark valley. The place where the 9 torches had disappeared hours ago. Sauron, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth, even if it's an ugly one. I turned to face him. Bram told me about the calling, about the ones who die in it. You knew that when you asked me to stay. So tell me, what were you really asking for that night? The bond with all of it? Or just me here, human, at a safe distance for as long as I'd give you? He was silent a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw. When I asked you to stay, I'd already decided I would never let you take the calling, he said. Never. I'd take whatever years a human life gives, and when the time came I'd bury you too and add you to the long list, and I'd thought I'd made my peace with that. Because the alternative, watching you burn up in 3 days because of something I wanted, I would rather die 1,000 times. So no, I never wanted the bond. I wanted you, however little of you the world would let me keep, and I called myself selfish for even that. He looked at me, and the moonlight caught the silver in his hair, and he had never looked more like a man and less like a king. I will love you human slow, Myra. I'll love you a normal lifetime's worth and count myself the luckiest creature that ever lived. I don't need the bond. I need you breathing, that's all. That's everything. And that was the moment I understood the real shape of what was happening between us. Because the unthinkable thing he'd asked for on this wall, stay, want it back, he'd already softened. He'd already chosen to want less, to protect me. He'd taken the dangerous thing off the table the moment he understood what it might cost me. So the unthinkable thing was mine to ask for now. No, I said. He blinked, no. No, I don't want a careful, human, slow, safe distance lifetime where you spend every day braced to bury me. I've lived that, Soren. I lived it with Leela. I loved her safe and careful and from one valley over, and she died alone while I was being sensible somewhere else. I am done being sensible. I'm done loving people at a distance that's supposed to protect me, because all the distance ever protected me from was the love. My voice was shaking and I let it shake. I want the calling. I want the bond. I want to feel your heart in my chest across any distance for the rest of whatever life I get. And I want that life to be a long one. And if I burn up in 3 days, then at least I'll burn up having reached for something instead of dying slow and safe, and full of regret like I almost did in that river. Soren had gone white. Myra, you don't understand what you're asking. I understand exactly what I'm asking. I'm a healer. I've sat with the dying and I've held the living, and I know precisely what the body can and can't carry, better than Bram, better than you. I've made my choice. The only question, I stepped closer to him, close as we'd never let ourselves be all winter, is whether you're brave enough to let me make it, or whether you're going to protect me right out of the only thing I've wanted in 8 months. He looked at me like a man at the edge of a cliff being asked to jump. If you die, he whispered, it will be me that killed you. If I die, I said, it'll be me that chose it. There's a difference. You taught me that yourself on this very wall. I took his shaking hands in mine, the first time I'd let myself all winter, and they were so warm and they closed around mine like they'd been waiting. Soren, be brave enough to let me love you the way I want to. That's all I've ever asked of anyone. No one's ever said yes. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind off the snow. Then he leaned his forehead down against mine, and I felt the wetness of his tears, and he said, in a voice I felt more than heard, yes. The calling began at moonrise 3 nights later, in the old way, in a circle of the whole pack with torches in the snow. I won't pretend I wasn't afraid. Bram had told me how it went, that the wolf calls his nature into the human's blood, and the body either learns to carry it or burns trying, and that for 3 days there's nothing anyone can do but wait and hold on. He told me which one had lived and which one hadn't, and the one who hadn't had been young and strong and full of life, and the one who'd lived had been a tired old woman everyone expected to die. There was no telling. That was the horror of it. There was no telling who the calling kept. Soren held me through all of it. That's the part I remember in pieces, because the fever took most of it from me. I remember the cold of the snow at my back and the unbearable heat building under my skin, like my own blood had caught fire. I remember Soren's voice, low and unbroken, saying my name over and over like a rope thrown down into a well. I remember a moment in the deepest part of the second night when the fire in me became a thing with a will of its own, something vast and ancient and wolf, prowling the edges of who I was and asking, in a language older than words, whether there was room enough in me to let it in. And I remember thinking of Leela, and of the baby born on the longest night, and of 32 people upright and breathing, and of a man weeping into my hair on a wall in the snow. And I remember opening every closed door in myself at once and saying yes, yes, come in, there's room, there was always room, I just never let anyone use it. And then, I remember the third dawn. I remember waking with my head on Soren's chest and his heart beating under my ear, and I remember, and this is the thing I will never have words enough for, I remember feeling 2 heartbeats. His under my ear, and his again, somehow, inside my own chest, steady and warm and unmistakably him, The way you'd feel your own pulse, except it wasn't mine and it would never be only mine again. I had lived. The pack was weeping in the snow around us. Bram had his old face in his hands, and Soren was looking down at me like the sun had personally chosen to rise just to prove the world wasn't only a place where things came to die. And he said my name, Myra, and I felt the word land in two places at once, in my ears and in my chest, and I started to laugh and cry at the same time because I was alive and I was loved and I had reached for something at last, and it had reached back. I would like to tell you that's where it ends. The girl from the river, the grieving king, the bond against all odds, the long warm life ahead. I would like to leave you there in the snow in the dawn with two hearts beating. But I'm a healer, and healers don't get to look away from the things they wish weren't true. Because in the slow weeks of spring that followed, as my strength came back and I settled into a life I'd chosen with both eyes open, I kept thinking about Edric, about how he died. The marsh-lung had killed 30 of the early cases not at all, and had killed the late cases the way it always did, slow, with the cough and the gray. All except Edric. Edric had been first. Edric had gone from a cough to dead in 11 days when the sickness usually took twice that, and his fever had broken and come back in a pattern I'd treated 100 times and never once seen behave like his did. At the time, I'd been too buried in saving the living to think hard about the one I'd lost. I thought hard about it now. So one gray afternoon, I went back to the room where Edric had died, which no one had touched, and I found his things still there, and I found, tucked behind the others on the shelf, a small clay cup. And in the dried dregs at the bottom of that cup, I found a fine pale residue I knew. Not marsh-lung. Marsh-lung is a sickness of the lung. It doesn't leave residue in a cup. This was a powder. A root ground fine, one I taught the gatherers to fear, all those weeks ago, pressing it into their hands and making them smell the bitter underside so they'd never mistake it for marrow thistle. The killer that mimics the cure. Someone had given it to him. Someone who knew enough to make it look like the grey rot. Someone who'd wanted the king's brother dead and the king himself broken. In the very winter, a sickness gave them perfect cover. I stood in that cold room with the cup in my hand, and I felt the bond go taut in my chest, felt Soren stir somewhere far off in the stronghold, felt him feel my fear before I'd even decided what to do with it. In a moment he'd come. In a moment I'd have to tell him that his brother hadn't been taken by an accident of winter, that somewhere close, someone had walked these halls smiling and poured death into a cup. I closed my fingers around the residue. I had reached for a life, and the life had reached back, and I had thought the hard part was finally behind me. I am beginning to understand that it never is.